All right, I think we're going to be live in just a moment here. Okay. Good day to everybody everywhere. Thank you so much for joining us once again for the Chongxiang School of Tibetan Medicine webinar series. Here, from our baseline of Tibetan medicine studies, we discuss topics of health and wellness, exploring tools from Eastern and Western traditions, ancient spiritual philosophies, healing sciences, along with modern research and current issues in global public health. We would love to connect with you, so please join our email list and feel free to tune in on social media, YouTube, as you like. Today, we are very pleased. We're going to be welcoming our special guest, the acclaimed psychotherapist, writer, and soul activist, Francis Weller. Mr. Weller's work synthesizes diverse streams of thought and culture into a unique and dynamic style, which he styles soul-centered psychotherapy. This innovative work draws from psychology, mythology, indigenous cultural wisdom, alchemy, poetry, and more. We will discuss Mr. Weller's work in the context of human health and wellness today. What can we learn from the ancient wisdom heritage of human cultures to help us deal with fear, sorrow, loss, and uncertainty, things which are very prominent in our society today worldwide? What integrative tools can we use to experience ancient wisdom and explore our soul work without delving into cultural appropriation or the fetishizing of traditional cultures? Specifically, how can we apply these tools to help us cope with the challenges of the current COVID-19 global health pandemic? Now, normally, as most of you know, we're here with our ongoing host and our school director, Menpa Phuntsog Wangmo. She's having a bit of technical difficulties so far this morning, but will hopefully be able to drop in and share some of her insight from the traditional Tibetan medicine perspective on the physiological effects of fear and loss and what we can do about that. So for those of you who may be new to our show, let me tell you just a little bit about our school. The Chongxiang Institute School of Tibetan Medicine was founded by the late acclaimed Tibetan scholar and spiritual teacher Chogyal Namkhai Norbu as part of the greater International Chongxiang Institute of Tibetan Studies. We offer courses on traditional Tibetan medicine all around the world and online in various places. Our programs range from short lectures, continuing education units for healthcare professionals, all the way to our flagship program, our full-length 4-year training of traditional Tibetan medicine, which coincidentally, we are starting our new cohort in January, and there are a couple weeks left to submit applications. So if anyone out there is serious about diving into a complete, profound training of traditional Tibetan medicine as part of your long-term healing and work goals, please do contact us and we would be happy to tell you more about the program. And please follow us on Facebook and YouTube, and please do join our email list for important updates and new information. So let me tell you a little bit about our special guest. Mr. Weller is the founder and director of Wisdom Bridge, an organization offering educational programs that seek to integrate the wisdom from indigenous cultures along with the insights and knowledge gathered from Western poetic, psychological, and spiritual traditions. He has authored numerous books, including The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Rituals of Renewal, and the Sacred Work of the Ordinary, Essays in a Time of Uncertainty. Francis received 2 master's degrees from the John F. Kennedy University in clinical psychology and transpersonal psychology. His writings have appeared in anthologies and journals exploring the confluence between psyche, nature, and culture. He has worked with thousands of people, offered teachings, presentations, and leading retreats at prestigious venues worldwide. Francis, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Adam. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Excellent. So, and this, I think, for the first time, we are all tuning in from the greater Northern California region. So we can have the same time zone for once.
Right.
But thank you so much for joining us. Now, these days on our webinar, we usually start with the same general question to get things going. And that is, how are things going for you in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic? How has it affected your work and your community, and what have your responses been in your work and working with your community to the COVID-19 crisis?
Well, the most direct way was that we no longer gather to do our sessions in person. And we haven't been able to offer community grief rituals or rituals of any kind for the last year. So there's been this gap, because when there is such a critical time, there is a need to be in community. That's the primal matrix for responding to trauma or to threat or to danger or to suffering, is to gather. So we've had to be improvising our ways of meeting with others. So we've done 4-week series on what I call the Apprenticeship with Sorrow online. Four sessions. We've done that twice, and the hunger for that is very strong. I think we do know on some level that we are entering a time when the old fictions of how the world was functioning are collapsing. They're being shaken. And the denial around that is being broken. So the grief that's arising up is profound. But we don't have places to take them right now. So we're having to really reimagine the context for how do we hold all this in our isolation, in our seclusion. The idea of having to shelter in place, but can we also imagine place as shelter? Can we imagine that the ground that we're sitting on is a place that can hold us? So I think we're also being asked to extend our imaginations outward while we're being forced inward, to kind of tie us into a larger communal field, even though we can't participate in it directly. We can feed that coherence of connectivity. One of the things we did in the Apprenticeship with Sorrow series was to have people create little shrines where they were. Because when we do our grief rituals, we have a communal shrine which we work around. And then we have a grief shrine. Well, now we had 300 small shrines. We called it a multi-centric space. So we were building a field of coherence with, I think, multiple continents, multiple countries at the same time, just trying to feel into the fact that we are still be able to hold each other together in that space. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. It's a really interesting idea how with the pandemic and we have this shelter in place, then as you mentioned, we're kind of really have the opportunity to tune in right exactly where we are, very locally, kind of going inwardly and stationary, having that sort of very small bubble. In fact, we literally are referring to this kind of thing as our bubble.
Right.
But then at the same time, we have this kind of greater expansion into, for example, what we're doing right now. We're on Zoom, we're connecting over the internet, communication-wise to a greater extent. So it's kind of this inward and outward potential expansion. Now, you just mentioned that when you mentioned this grief shrine, and in this work that you're doing that is specific to grief and loss, but the first thing it reminds me of is having this kind of localized area and this shrine for your own kind of set intention in your spot where we're sheltering, and how you mentioned ground as shelter. How can the actual land that we're on physically inhabiting how can we connect with that for our own health? It reminds me of the Native American tradition of vision quest, when you will have a similar intention, a shrine or a stone circle or a kind of place that you're really sinking into and getting that wisdom. So it's a very interesting connection.
I think that our soul, my tradition is a soul-based tradition, uh, and then the other language would be the anima mundi, the soul of the world. That there's an inner and an outer, a micro and a macro, as above, so below correspondence. So when I attune to the soul of the world in the trees and the birds and the stones and the creeks, I am fostering an intimacy that places me somewhere. Part of the problem with our reliance on technology is it becomes an abstraction. I'm in a sense dislocated. I didn't know where you were until you told me. As opposed to when we gather in ritual space, we are sheltering in that space together. So to walk outside your door, whether you're living in a city or you're out in the country, you have an opportunity to notice the place that's holding you. And I think that's very important. I went to bed a couple months ago carrying a lot of dread, just a heaviness in my body. And something compelled me to get up and go over to my bookshelf, and I pulled down a little collection of essays by a wonderful Chickasaw writer named Linda Hogan. And Linda had an essay in there called All My Relations. And I realized how this dread that I was feeling had kind of collapsed me inward. And I had forgotten all my relations. So I began to extend my tendrils out to the oaks and to the bay and to the redwoods and to the crickets and to the stars and the moon. And I began to remember my greater identity is composite. It isn't singular. My greater sense of identity is multiple and and immense. I am large. In the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, they tried to come up with an image to describe the depths of the soul, and the image they came up with was the night sky. That's how immense we are. That's how big we are. And when we can remember that extension, especially right now when there's so much fear and uncertainty, which tends to cause a contraction, if we can practice our feeding those tendrils of intimacy and connectivity, the incredibly wild entanglement that actually exists with every breath we take. Every breath I take in is an inhalation of the grasses and the trees and the oceans, offering us their gift. Every exhalation is a gift to them, our carbon dioxide. The fact that I can see you right now is a gift of the photons from the sun. There's not a moment in which we aren't entangled. But again, fear and dread and deep grief can cause us to contract and to come into a singularity, and we can feel cut off. Trauma especially has that potential to cut us off from feeling a part of the wider cosmological ground.
Thank you so much. That's really beautiful imagery. I love that kind of idea of each of our individual souls represented as the expansiveness of the collective, entire night sky or the entire universe. Yeah, I think that it's a really important articulation to keep in mind as we're kind of sunk into this kind of hunkered down, sheltering type mentality. It's really unnatural and anxiety provoking. It kind of it can kind of exacerbate some of the existing problems that our society was going towards, with more reliance on individual online content, less interpersonal connection. I mean, that was already kind of happening and becoming a problem, and with this COVID-19 crisis really kind of accelerated that, and we can see the results of that. So I really appreciate how you mentioned tuning in with our greater spectrum of community, whether it be our friends and relatives and loved ones, all the people around us, even all the just life around us, the trees, animals, even the ground itself. And as you mentioned, that's an idea that is very well represented in Native American wisdom. Um, as for example, as you often hear from the Sioux tradition, the term aho mitake oyasin, all of our relations, is a beautiful perspective that is so easy to lose in modern time, and any way that we can tune that back in is great.
Right.
So thank you for that. Let's see. You said one other thing that I wanted to comment on. Yeah, so from what I'm learning about some of your work with your group and community work with grief, and then it's becoming really clear that interpersonal, that collective intention physically as well is really important with doing grief work. And that really resonates for me as well, for example, in medical practice as well. Now we're doing medical practice online and kind of in the context how we're doing right now. And missing that kind of connective, communal, physical interaction is such a big deal. It's a huge game changer. It changes everything as well. So thank you for sharing some of these insights, how you can kind of bridge that gap and deal with that situation of not having that in-person live experience for that grief work.
Yeah, I mean, the primary ways in which we feel our own incarnation are through touch and mirroring. When we're not touched, our sense of being becomes diminished, I think. So we have to be very creative at this time in terms of how do we augment the feeling of touch. So sunlight on the skin, wind on the skin, fragrances, all the ways that we can augment those feelings of being touched. We can be touched by the words of a friend, they'll touch our heart, they'll affect us. We can share our sorrows. I mean, we do share our grief online. It's a little more difficult, but it's still capable. We can still do it. Just to feel the entanglement with other human beings is so crucial, particularly when we can begin to feel very, very isolated and cut off. I think that's one of the things I appreciate most about traditional cultures is its profound emphasis on community. Jeanette Armstrong, a wonderful elder from the Okanagan culture in British Columbia, northern Pacific Northwest, says in the Okanagan culture, they frame their world this way, that community comes first, family second, and the individual is last. And when you frame it this way, no matter what happens to you as an individual, you are covered. She said in your culture, in the Western culture, you've inverted that completely.
Totally opposite.
It's the individual first, the family second. And you talk about community a lot, she says, but it's empty rhetoric. There's no blood in it. There's no bone in it. It just feels anemic. And we talk about community all the time because that's the thing that we long for. One of the greatest anxieties we carry in our bodies is a feeling of being outside, that we haven't received a sufficient sense of belonging, a sufficient sense of welcome into our bodies. So we're always trying to anxiously perform our lives, trying to convince other people that I'm worthy of being included. In the traditional ways of framing it, it was the job of the community to impress into the body of the child that they are a person of great wealth, very great value, and that they belong from the moment of their presence in the world. And again, we've inverted that 180 degrees where it's up to me to convince you that I'm somebody worthy of inclusion into the circle. But we live anxiously through that our entire lives. We have rallied behind the flag of individualism in Western culture. There's some value to it, but its shadow is massive, particularly the sense of emptiness that's we're left with. We lose so much by that individualism. We lose community, we lose ancestors, we lose a sense of participatory psyche with the ground around us. We lose traditions and rituals. We lose all the things that in a sense, shaped us as human beings over the long journey of our species. So consequently, we feel very anxious, and we try to fill that emptiness with all kinds of things, primarily secondary satisfactions like rank, privilege, supremacy, um, wealth, material goods, or addictions. You know, we always want more. We're a culture that consumes so much. And why is that? Why are we constantly trying to fill the emptiness with so much, material stuff? We make up what, 5% of the world's population, but we consume like 25 or 30% of the goods. There's something off here. And I think at the heart of that is this reliance on individualism. And again, that's why I keep looking to other traditional cultures to get a lens outside of our own view of that helps to illuminate our own myopia. The way we see things is not the way it is or the way it should be. And we don't really see how much we've lost as a consequence of this ideology of individualism.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that is fascinating. This idea of the inversion of the pyramid of our typical Western capitalistic modern culture. It's a really beautiful imagery, Francis. Thank you.
Mm.
Yeah, and it's something I've been hearing people talk about. You know, we have that pyramid mindset, that get to the top. But the fact is, when you're standing on the very pinnacle of a pyramid, you are occupying an extremely small and unstable and limited space. The limitations of that is incredible. So really the idea of flipping that and being nestled into the resources of the entire world supporting you in that way is really important. And that reminds me of kind of what we talk about in Chinese medicine in terms of the cultural view that comes from, ancient kind of Chinese medicine culture. In terms of when we compare that with our modern American view, our modern American society is so kind of future oriented, always looking ahead to the next thing, the next accomplishment, the next acquisition, and then sort of forgetting the past. We see that a lot in medicine, a whole lot. In modern Western medicine, we have these incredible technological advances and the pinnacle of research, and whatever is the most absolutely current becomes the kind of only relevant thing. And there's this kind of attitude to generalize. There's this kind of attitude you see where everything in the past is just kind of like, forget about it. It's only matters of what's happening right now, the most modern, the most fancy thing. And we see that a lot in the medical context. But in Chinese medicine, it's really quite the opposite. Also in Tibetan medicine, it's really quite the opposite. In that context, you have an enormous focus on the lineage behind you and all of the accomplishments and the collective wisdom of the many generations coming from behind you. In Tibetan medicine, you see this so strongly emphasized, this kind of being pushed forward and supported by this massive past, this beautiful, illustrious past. And that is your culture, and that is your community, and that is the kind of nestling into the what we call in Tibetan medicine, the kind of heavy nourishment, the chut, the sort of essence of the world that can nourish you progressively. So
Beautiful.
I love that connection. Thank you.
Beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, I think progress is another one of those things we try to stuff the emptiness with. Always trying to get to someplace better because where we are feels empty. It's insufficient. It's as if our Western culture is built on the edifice of never feeling satisfied. We're in a constant state of dissatisfaction, because the primary satisfactions of being with one another around a fire at night and sharing the stories, sharing meals together, looking at the stars together, doing rituals to address our losses and also our gratitudes, to take the young ones through initiatory practices. Those are the primary satisfactions. Those are the things that shaped us over hundreds of thousands of years. And almost in the blink of an eye, they have been abandoned. So in its stead, which was traditions, right? Those were the things that shaped us. Those are the movements that made us human over that long, long process of gestation as people. And when we abandon those, when we forget those, the only thing we can look for is how do we get better? And that's, I see that in my own practice when I'm sitting with people in my office. There's an obsession with progression, always getting better, always getting better. Well, what drives that? And then part of what drives that obsession with progress is a fear that if I don't get myself all together, I won't be good enough to be welcomed. I won't be good enough to be loved. So there's a profound anxiety. So one of my first things I do with people in my office or even in the workshops is we try to slow down to geologic speed. When I was a young man when I was licensed. I was 27 years old when I got licensed to be a therapist. And I was smart enough to know I didn't know anything about sitting with people. So I knew I needed to have a mentor. And so I called, at that point, I was living in Oakland, and I called the Jung Institute in San Francisco, and I got the names of a number of analysts in the area, and I called them all up. And then when I talked to this one man, his name was Clark Berry, I said, this is the man I want to sit with. And I showed up at Clark's door, and he opened the door, and my first thought was, my God, this man is ancient. He must be 60 years old. He looks so old, you know. And now I can laugh at that. And we sat down face to face, and he reached over, and the very first thing he said to me basically was, he patted this big rock he had by his chair, and he said, this is my clock. I operate at geologic speed. And if you're going to work with the soul, you need to learn this rhythm, because this is how the soul moves. Then he pointed to his clock and he said, it hates this. That was the single most important teaching I have ever received on how to do therapy, is how to slow people down. You know, there's no way you can rush through the process of tending grief or tending a soul that's been bruised and battered by trauma. That requires slowing down to the speed of soul, deep listening, deep attention, deep honoring of the suffering that's there, offering the balm of compassion, whether it's self-compassion or the compassion granted by others, but slowing it down. Ritual is a process Malidoma Some, my friend, called ritual the anti-machine. He said, you have to be very careful what you associate with, because you begin to, over time, you begin to match its rhythm. So when we match the rhythm of ritual, we come back into a rhythm that's a kindred to soul. And that's the rhythm that we have to come back to over and over and over again. That's the rhythm of nature. It's the rhythm of our bodies. It's the rhythm of song, of poetry. It's the rhythm of beauty. That's the rhythm we need to reclaim. Geologic speed. I'm even not sure how we got there, but yeah.
Geologic speed. I love that. That's beautiful and powerful. It reminds me of, we have these kind of themes in traditional Tibetan medicine, is also represented for our health as being very important, because in Tibetan medicine theory, we have the transition of the hours of the day. There I go, diving right back into it. The hours, no, the cycles of the day and night, and then the seasons, and even the greater astrological cycles are all dictated by the course of transition of the elements, all in elemental terms, coming back to these kind of universal building blocks, correlating with cycles of heat and cool, cycles of the transition of elemental theory. And this is considered extremely important for tuning in the way we eat, the way we sleep, the way we work, every aspect of life. And as you mentioned, I really resonate when we are supplanting that with this just clock face, just plastered right over the top of the whole world with this kind of digital delineation of time and scheduling. It is so unnatural, and it's so unhealthy. It can supplant the natural flow of life in potentially every way. Instead of taking each task as its own individual moment. And for example, our conversation, we can just have our conversation, and when it's a reasonable kind of finishing moment energetically to wrap up, we'll wrap up then, and that will dictate our interaction. But if we supplant that with an absolute clockwork schedule time, and then it's like, well, you were going to say something amazing, but we got to go. This is so unnatural. And I really agree with you that it's so important to tune into those natural cycles of time and use that for our healing and for our long-term health.
That's right. Totally agree. Totally agree. There's a way in which the soul's movements and rhythms, when we begin to pay attention to them, by its own character, requires us to slow down. We then write letters. We're not just trying to clip off a text to somebody, but I mean, I value that's helpful at times, but that we kind of pay attention to the moods of soul. Sometimes there's a heavy mood, there's a blue mood, there's a dark mood. Those are the ways that soul speaks to us. But in our, as you say, in the regimen of trying to keep on schedule, we bypass those. And then soul has to speak with a little bit more intensity. And if we don't pay attention to that, then it turns into symptomology. We become depressed. And I think this depression is the soul's refusal to move at the manic speed of culture. So I really respect depression as its own intelligence. I mean, depression can be very difficult to deal with, absolutely. But there's an intelligibility in it that is its own refusal to adapt the mania of the machine and to slow us down and bring us to our knees, where we can acknowledge the ways in which we have suffered as a consequence of living in a culture that has forgotten what it means to be human. We are told to become consumers, producers. We have roles to play, but we rarely get asked, who are you? And what gift did you come here to give away? What did you arrive with when you came out of mystery into this land, into this place? Wouldn't it be wonderful to know that you were needed to deliver that? So it's so different than what I often say is, the obscenity of earning a living. That phrase is so obscene, that I have to earn my living. But that's not something that's just granted by the sheer fact of my incarnation. That my living is my expression of what my soul came here to do, rather than what role was I asked to fulfill. The poverty of that is part of our grief, I think.
The poverty of earning a living. Yes, absolutely. So you mentioned when we were talking a little bit before, you mentioned that you were doing some writing and articulating in response to this year in the kind of the entire Western United States. We had this experience of these drastic fires that caused so much damage and fear and uncertainty, kind of throughout enormous swaths of our entire nation here in the United States. So can you tell me a little bit about how this work that you work with, kind of, what was your response with that, and what were some of the messages that you received from that and articulated to share with your audience around that event?
The fires have been relentless for the last 4 years. We ourselves were out of our home for almost 2 weeks, this past one, and became very close to our home.
I'm sorry to hear that. It's really scary.
It's very scary. And what you're reminded of is just how everything is, in the Buddhist terms, nothing persists. Everything is a phantom. We don't get to hold on to anything. Impermanence is the rule. So we have to be willing to to learn the difficult practices of letting go over and over and over again. What I wrote about in terms of the fires, in terms of COVID, and but also in the larger cultural context that we're facing right now around Black Lives Matter and people of color and the whole breakdown of the binary gender dynamics, the economic injustices, is that we're entering what I call the long dark. And this might last generations. I don't know. But what feeds me around that idea of the long dark is the wisdoms that comes out of the traditions of alchemy. And alchemy speaks of these different, I wouldn't say stages, but different seasons that we encounter. One of them is the Negredo. And the Negredo was their word for the blackening. And they also talk about the albedo and the rubedo, and there's another one, the yellowing. The albedo is the whitening, the rubedo is the reddening, and then there's sometimes some systems talk about the yellowing, and they're all elementally based processes. But this idea of the Negredo, that we're entering into the Negredo, can feel really scary because we are an ascension culture. We like the brightly lit territories. We like things shiny and clear and certain, but we're entering a time of uncertainty. The last collection of essays I wrote was called In the Absence of the Ordinary. It's all gone. We can't walk down the street right now and hug somebody that you meet on the street. You can't go to a baseball game. You can't go to the movies. None of that's, all the ordinary things have kind of been disrupted. But what the Negredo tells us in its wisdom is that all things have seasons. Like nature is not always blossoming. It's not always flowering. It's not always fruiting. There are seasons in nature in which there is decay, in which there is death, in which there is dissolution. And that's the phase that we're in right now. We're in a time of dissolution. In alchemy, the Negredo was called the subtle dissolver. And certainly we need some things in this culture to dissolve. We need patriarchy in its most egregious forms to dissolve. We need white supremacy to dissolve. We need economic injustice to dissolve. We need many of these systems to go through their process of decay and dissolution. The problem is that typically when there is that process of decay going on, that fear that's generated by it can typically activate even more emphatic emphasis on the old structure. So we see some segments of our society trying to reinforce the white supremacy, trying to reinforce the economic injustice, to try to reinforce all the old systems of gender bias and discrimination. Hopefully, the collective body, the soul of the culture. It's interesting that that language has actually come into the political arena right now, by Joe Biden talking about healing the soul of the culture right now. I'm intrigued by that. That the process of dissolution will be supported by the majority of us, or at least a significant portion of us. And we will allow that process or encourage that process of dissolution because it's going to happen one way or the other, either through some measure of grotesque collapse or through some measure of grace, depending on our levels of collaboration with it. It's going to happen. The systems are unsustainable. We cannot continue to consume this much material from the planet year after year. It's not possible. So what happens when that collapses? We either collaborate with it and find simpler means of living. We come back to the primary satisfactions that I mentioned before that really do satisfy the soul. It's like when, I'm sure you've had that experience, Adam, when you're in ritual space with a group of people and you're deep inside of that space, you're not wondering what's on TV tonight. You're not thinking about the next iPhone or the next car or the next thing you can buy online. You are satisfied, at least temporarily. You're satisfied. And that's what we have to remember again. So it's an odd grace that we're in right now, to witness the collapse. And then we must build the disciplines and the medicine to endure the long dark. How do we sustain ourselves in a time of decay? What are the practices? Like silence and solitude, like self-compassion, like prayer and ritual. These things help us to endure the long dark. And we begin to dream into new rituals, new practices that we can hopefully pass on to the generations that follow. We have a lot of young ones who are coming into our rituals now and learning how to do grief rituals and gratitude rituals. We've had the initiation process kind of redreamt that we've been doing it's a year-long process that we take young men through this process of shaping them into men of character and depth. And these are the rituals that have been given to us from the land that we're on. These are not importations of other traditions. They're not impersonations of other traditions. They are the dream. This is the earth dreaming itself into a new form, a new imagination, a new culture. And that's where I put my faith right now. This is not a time of hope. This is not a time but I have faith in this time that there is an intelligence in the earth. There's an intelligence in the soul of the world that can guide us. And if we attune to that, we'll have something to build something on.
Absolutely. Wow, thank you so much. Yeah, the time of dissolution, perfectly natural cyclical flow. In elemental medicine and Tibetan medicine, this exactly what you're referring to right now would be articulated by the water element. We have the transition of the elements. Everything will, begin with the first sprout of the wood element, the first springing forth of life, birth, conception, tiny new sprout. And we'll go through the entire cycle of life into that water element where everything, goes from consolidating in and then dissolving, kind of losing its form, kind of releasing all attachment and going back into that, watery energetic state. And that's that darkness that you referred to. That's just like we have currently this winter season. And it's perfectly natural. It's completely healthy. And like you said, if we can embrace that in a graceful way and find the wisdom in that elementally, philosophically, then we can hope to come through that with wisdom and have a beautiful new springtime to come. So thank you for that. Yeah. So you mentioned the need for ritual and what that would mean and how that can work. Now, in our modern culture in this country, we've lost an enormous amount. We've had an enormous amount of dissociation from the idea of ritual, from these community connection, from the kind of healthy rituals that can sustain us and heal us. And we just kind of have gone very far from that idea in many ways. So can you tell us a little bit more about how you share about ritual, what it can mean for modern people? What are the core values of that? And then if we have time, how can we implement that in this modern age to meet our modern needs?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'd love to do that. Let me pick up one thread that just came to mind. One of the other binary systems that I hope is breaking down is the light dark binary, light good, dark bad. That has been a kind of an inherited ideology out of our Judeo-Christian tradition. But I really want us to feel the possibility that this negredo that we're entering, this long dark that we're entering, is holy ground. There's a wonderful passage from Rainer Maria Rilke, the wonderful Austrian poet, where he said, "And no matter how deeply I go down into myself, My God is dark, and like a webbing made of 100 roots that drink in silence. So there's something that our reclamation has to incorporate the holiness that dwells in the darkness. You know, whether that's the darkness of skin color, the darkness of our psyches, the darkness of the earth, we have to begin to really reimagine the sacredness that dwells there and get out of that horrible binary system of light, white, good, dark, black, bad. That has been one of the worst ideologies that we've clung to for 400 years, 500 years. So wanted to just share that as well. So ritual, where do we enter with that? I think one of the fears we have around ritual is on some instinctive level, we know that ritual has the potential to shake us and to dislodge us from the premise of always being in control. I think our anxiety around exclusion, around rejection, around abandonment is so great that we maintain a very rigid control on our emotional bodies. And ritual invites a loosening of that control. It invites us to be on our knees side by side, weeping with other human beings. Now, that's scary, but it's absolutely essential. It's absolutely necessary that we have those times when we collectively gather to address the sorrows of our community. Ritual is the most ancient form of artistic and communal practice. If you look, some anthropologists and archaeologists say that we probably had ritual before we had language. That the most ancient artifacts you find are burial sites. That those deposits of red ochre and flint and food sources for the next life. We've been doing grief rituals for probably 500,000 years. 300,000 years we've been doing grief rituals. That's in our bones. That's in our psychic and physiological DNA. I can't tell you how many times, Brad, Adam, when we've done a grief ritual, at the end of it, someone might say something like, I've never done anything like this before in my life, but it felt oddly familiar. So what is that? What is it that recognized that rhythm was something familiar to them? Well, I think that's the deep memory that we inherited. We are ritual creatures. Like I said, we've been doing ritual for hundreds of thousands of years. And that memory is deep in our bodies. So when we're around it, we recognize it. We know on some level that we need it. If you watch children playing, they're doing ritual all the time. They're, setting up choreographies, and then you go over here and you do this, and then you come over here and you do that, and then you come over here and then we'll do this. And they're expressing that innate ritual practice all the time. But then we get taught out of it because of our need to be in control. I talk about it, ritual, in terms of two axes, the horizontal axis and the vertical axis. I use the word ceremony for the horizontal axis. We have wedding ceremonies, we have graduation ceremonies. Hopefully we're about to have an inauguration ceremony. Those practices keep rebinding the community together. It keeps the community strong, and we need those practices. Ritual is the vertical. Ritual connects spirit to soul, connects the heavens to the earth. And that axis is the one that has the potential to dislodge our current structure. That's why it's scary. I talk about it in the language of derangement, that ritual can derange us. In fact, my hope is that you never come out of a ritual the same as you went in. My hope is that when you went into the ritual process, something got shaken. You were deranged a little bit. because the current arrangement isn't working. And you need to be rearranged in a way that's more coherent with the way the soul wants to express itself at this time. The derangement is, again, unsettling. So we have to slowly, learn how to once again enter into that space. And I've taught a lot of people how to gently enter the ritual ground through simple practices. You can do ritual by yourself. You can go out in the morning, greet the sun, and say thank you. And maybe lay a few pollen, grams of pollen on the ground, or cornmeal, or some seed, and just say thank you for this day. And greet those who are there, the birds, the stars. The moon is still up this morning as we walked outside and greeted her presence in the sky. And the life around us is worthy of our greeting, and that can be a ritual practice. It can tie you back in over and over again every day into that extended tendril of entanglement that I mentioned early on in our conversation. So that's a ritual practice you can do. And that can derange you subtly into remembering your more composite, more coextensive identity, which is so helpful in getting through these days. Let's see what else to say about ritual. It doesn't have to be complex. People often come to the grief rituals and they say, well, how can I do this at home? So, well, maybe post-COVID or maybe during COVID online, you can say, on Friday night, we're going to meet for several hours, and the topic is going to be loss. And we will be in ritual space together, which means basically that we will gather in a way that has no agenda of fixing, no advice giving, but deep witnessing. The grief, I'll just speak about grief for a moment. Grief requires two things in order to be set down. It needs containment and release. And what ritual does is it provides a fierce enough container so that I'm relieved of the duty of containment and can focus primarily on release. If I'm doing this all by myself, I can't do both jobs at the same time. So we become a permanent containment field for our grief. And many people, if you notice, we are chewing the same griefs over and over again, sometimes for decades, sometimes for generations. That much of the grief that we're carrying isn't even ours. It began generations ago.
Yeah, that's right.
And we're still chewing it. We're still chewing it. So what ritual provides is a fierce enough container to enable the raw emotion of grief, of outrage, or even the emotion of gratitude to come forward fully and to shake us, to move us. And that's vitally important. That's absolutely essential that we have spaces for that. Otherwise, there is a tendency to compress that energy. So people come into my practice, and I imagine yours too, suffering from what they call depression. And as I was sitting listening to them, I realized it's not depression, it's oppression. It's the accumulated weight of all the untended sorrows of their life. And again, probably of lifetimes, generations of untended sorrow. It sets on them like sediment, and it oppresses the soul, their spirit. Ritual is the way in which traditionally we kept that from settling and becoming a firmament. In alchemy, they say the most important thing in the process of working with the material is to keep it warm. You have to keep the material warm through our attention, through our affection, through our noticing, through our efforts, through our kindness. You keep the material warm. Ritual, again, traditionally, has been one of the primary ways in which that material is kept warm. There's a lot of heat in ritual. We cook the material in ritual space, and it becomes loosened rather than hardened and congealed, and then it can move. Most traditional cultures say that grief is a toxin, that it's supposed to be kept moving out of us over and over again. And if we were a sane culture, we'd have grief rituals in our communities every month. But we're not a sane culture. So we offer our grief rituals. We have literally people coming from Australia and from England and all across the United States just for the privilege of being able to grieve side by side with another human being. Now, that's wonderful that they come, but that's at the heart of all our sorrows, our amnesia. I say the two primary sins of our culture are amnesia and anesthesia. We forget and we go numb. And in this great amnesia, we forget that we need this. We need to be able to grieve side by side with all our kin every month, every week. Then we might be sane again. We might actually get to be current, because most of our lives are chewing on the past. And so grief work gets us current in many ways, not just in the present moment, but also in the current of life, the electricity of life, the joy of being alive. This should be a joyous thing as well as a melancholy thing, but also in the current of life, the river of life, the flow of life, all those ways in which ritual has a way of consistently returning us back to the present moment. It repairs and sutures the tears in our code of belonging over and over again. It gives us an avenue to collectively express our gratitude for the generosity of the planet and the cosmos. It gives us ways of taking our young ones through the white water of adolescence into a robust, beginning as members of the sacred community. That's what ritual did for our entire species lifetime. And in the absence of that, we are really, really bereft of communal means of addressing these issues that we will face. Michael Mead, one of my friends and teachers, talked about that there are 3 levels of experience. There's the first level, which is the social level of, hey, how's it going? Good to see you today. Yeah, lovely day out today. Yeah. The third level is deep soul contact. The second layer is anger, grief, hatred, violence, jealousy, betrayal. And Michael says you can't get from layer 1 to layer 3 without going through layer 2. But layer 2 requires holding spaces, ritual ground to hold them meaningfully. And in the absence of ritual ground, these layer 2 events erupt uncontained. They're burning down cities and suicides and overdoses. And we know the way they're being expressed because they are not being held in ritual space. And that's part of our job as mature human beings, is to create atmospheres that can offer holding space for that. So I often talk about taking up an apprenticeship with sorrow. And in the old language of apprenticing, you would apprentice sometimes, you've been studying for a long time, right? It's a long apprenticeship, 10, 15, yes, 20 years. And at the end of that, you might be called a master painter, a master craftsman, a master farrier, or a potter. In the work of soul and the work of the apprenticeship with sorrow, you don't become a master. The long apprenticeship with sorrow, if you can keep a fidelity to that apprenticeship, in the end of that, you become an elder. That's gorgeous. And an elder is someone who has not turned away from the fierce fires of life. They're willing to turn into it and look at it and digest it and metabolize it into a tincture of medicine that they can bring back for the youth and for those in need, for a community that's suffering. And that's what we need right now is elders who are carrying a certain gravitas, a dignified bearing, that when they see trouble in the streets, they're not looking at their portfolio, they're looking at the need that's present and how do they offer that medicine back. That's what I would love to see more and more of.
Thank you so much for that. Wow. It's really beautiful stuff, Francis. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
So when you were presenting, when you were just explaining kind of the way you articulate the basic structure of ritual, And you described it in this kind of horizontal vertical grid, this ceremonial structure, and then ritual kind of work. One thing it really reminds me of in Tibetan Buddhism, when we have a structure of meditation practices or different, just kind of in general, philosophically, the way that things operate, we have this a similar dynamic in Tibetan Buddhism, which we will call, in English, we would say method and wisdom that combine. And sometimes this is articulated as a type of male and female energetic interplay. But you will have like a method, which would be a structure of some kind, or as you kind of said, like a container of some kind, some sort of methodology structure. But then within that structure, you use the function, sort of the natural function of wisdom, which is the energetic expression. And that is not structured. That can be emotional, it can be reactive, it can be playful, spontaneous, um, it can be it can be free flowing, this energetic structure, and so that sort of container with a potentially wild energy working within it is kind of what we articulate in Tibetan Buddhism very often. And it reminds me of how you are articulating this kind of basic capacity of a ritual being somehow we hold a space and then we can work within that space and let things really unfold and flow spontaneously.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, the old idea is that you can plan a ritual and you can create the container, but once the ritual begins, you're not in charge anymore. Then it is the collective dynamic that's there. It's the the interface with the ancestors. It's the elemental process that's there. It's the generative process that's there, and that dynamism is what creates the change. If you come out of the ritual the same as you went into it, there wasn't much dynamic energy present. So you want to create spaces where I like how you're saying it there, that wisdom potential has the ability to reanimate or reinform us in a different way, to make us larger. That's the hope of again, coming out of rituals, that you come out larger. When we do the prayers at the beginning, at the end of the ritual, I often say, we're talking to the ancestors, talking to the sacred cosmos, I don't know, to the mystery, whatever language we want to use. I often say, you've heard our grief all weekend. You've heard the sorrows. You've heard the pain. You've heard the grief. You've heard the stories. Now help us move this. And please know that we're not doing this only for our own sake. We're doing it so that our hearts might become less burdened, that our hearts might become freer to love this world more vigorously, that we might bring more love to the street, to our families, to our children, to our friendships, to ourselves. That we're doing this for the sake thereof, not just so I feel better. I think that's a huge part of that becoming an elder. You're not doing it just for you. You're doing it for the sake thereof. For the sake of the community, for the sake of the ancestors, for the sake of the land, for the sake of the watershed, for something beyond our own, personal gain. That's really at the heart of a lot of deep ritual practice. What I'm hearing from that tradition as well, from the Tibetan tradition as well, is it keeps repairing and renewing the vitality of everything that surrounds it. The community, the commons, the land, the spirit. That's what we should be doing.
Yes. Mm-hmm. It's beautiful. Yes, and that's very important in Tibetan medicine. We echo that sentiment exactly as you say. And as you said earlier, kind of strengthening and vitalizing our tendrils out into the surrounding world. In Tibetan medicine, for the possibility to heal and be in health and be moving forward with health and from a medical, even from a very pragmatic medical standpoint, we must understand that it's not just for our own personal benefit. Like you said, we have to develop that compassion and that awareness of the interconnectedness to the greater world, and connect with that. And so, in fact, in Tibetan medicine, we even go so far as to say that the root of all pathology is what we call marikpa, which we can call a delusion, or ignorance, or the lack of awareness of the real condition of things. And so when we lose track of that interconnectedness, when we lose that compassion, wisdom that we're part of a greater world, then we all of a sudden have the egocentric focus. And that is kind of, in a universal sense, the origin of the potential to develop disease and to descend into unhealth state. So
absolutely well said. Yeah. When I have the honor of working with the Cancer Help Program at Commonweal several times a year, and people come from all across the states, sometimes from other countries, and there's eight participants every session, and they've been doing this for 30 some odd years now. And at the end of the week-long retreat, I give them 10 practices that they can do to help optimize the healing response of body and soul to their illness. And I say you can do these in any order you want, but number one is number one, and that's self-compassion. There is no healing work that does not proceed from a place of self-compassion. And then number 10 is number 10, and that's service. That whatever you've gathered on your long journey of cancer, whatever wisdom you've collected, was never meant for you alone. So you start with self-compassion, but you end in compassion for the whole. You know, you have to care about yourself. You absolutely must care for your own well-being and your own healing practice, your own process. But then throw it like seed. It's meant as a giveaway. You know, if you keep it, it will rot. You know, be generous, give it away. And that's the same principles in AA and many other traditions, right? It's, you give it away. You give it away. Yeah. And in the giving away, you're reminded that, you know, how much has been given to you. I stand on many shoulders. I've been gifted and gifted and gifted by my elders, by my mentors, and by this loving world, and by my family. There's a wonderful poem by Rumi. He said, you know, for 60 years, I have been forgetful every moment, but not for 1 minute has this flowing towards me ceased or slowed. I deserve nothing. Today, I realized I am the guest the mystics speak of. Today, I play this living music for the host. Everything today is for the host.
that's beautiful. Wow. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
That's really great stuff.
Yeah, I really appreciate the mirroring reflection that comes out of your tradition that you've been studying, the Tibetan tradition, and how much when we drop down into the core essence of our own humanness, whether it's through alchemy or through soul work or through Tibetan wisdom, we find that common ground of what it means to try to articulate our lives meaningfully in ways that generate a sense of belonging and wholeness. That's gorgeous. That's beautiful. So I appreciate your sharings as well in this conversation.
Thank you, Francis.
Yeah.
Yeah, humanness. It's very, you know, that's one thing, as I'm sure you would agree, you know, if we have the honor and privilege and opportunity to study and learn from the different beautiful traditions around the world, like you said, there's so much commonality and the common streams of wisdom. And it really, very often you can articulate it as you just did, as coming back to our humanity and just staying human. In Tibetan culture, and then playing in with Tibetan medicine as well, we have this kind of metaphor of the different kind of presentations of consciousness in the universe, and of which, we kind of are the human end of the spectrum, kind of occupying this human condition of what it means to be human. But in modern society, and in our societies, we're very often straying from that in many ways. We are very often delving into anger and vengefulness and frustration into more of like a hell realm kind of presentation, or that craving and that desire and that sort of sense of something being missing into like that hungry ghost kind of realm. Or very commonly as well, in American society, we're reaching for that kind of God realm type of thing where we can encapsulate ourselves in some ideology of purity and opulence, and be separate, and really just be the king of our own castle. But what we're so often trying to do in Tibetan medicine, other traditions, is just bring people back to that communal humanity, just being right here and being together. And as you said earlier, that really can be the source of true sustainable and lasting abundant happiness and health.
Yeah, I think we have to have tremendous compassion for both of those directives, into the craving, into the addictions, to the anger, and into the transcendence. They both become strategic moves to cope with that feeling of emptiness, where that profound absence. I talk about the 5 gates of grief in my Wild Edge of Sorrow book, and grief is not just losing someone we love or something we love, but the second gate is that we lose whole parts of ourselves trying to fit into this culture through shame and through abuse and trauma. Then there's the sorrows of the world, the disappearance of species, the silencing of languages, and so forth. The fourth gate is what we expected and did not receive. That we are wired for this incredible participatory engagement with life. All of our senses are designed for participation. We're an amazing creature that's wired to engage. And we expected 40 pairs of eyes greeting us in the morning. We expected to gather the food together and the firewood, and we expected to hear the stories at night. And we expected that when there was trouble, we would do the rituals, when there was, all the things I mentioned before. When that is silence, when that fourth gate occurs, the most painful and egregious thing is that we feel that emptiness is a consequence of something I failed to do. What is wrong with me that I feel so empty? That emptiness can engender a tremendous amount of rage. Sometimes the rage is directed at the self, which is suicidal, which is self-punishing. I hated myself for 30 some odd years of my life. I was caught in that fiction. Or it can be expressed outward in violence, in trauma, in aggression, in hostility, in judgment, in blame. So that emptiness can be kind of addressed in trying to get outside of that emptiness, the transcendent function attempt to. But what we need to do, and is have the courage, that's what I also wrote about, is have the courage to face the emptiness. And that's damn hard. To turn around and look into that hole and see it for what it is. The good news is that we can begin to see it not as a commentary on my own failing, but on a profound absence that our collective culture failed to offer to me, to us. And that's where our grief has to be expressed. There's tremendous grief around this amnesia. There's the tremendous grief that we have forgotten how to hold one another and how to be human. We become caricatures of human beings. We become stereotypes of masculinity, tough, strong, heroic all the time. These caricatures make us invulnerable. And what we can remember by looking into the whole and into the emptiness is how much we have lost and how much we need one another to be human. Carl Jung said that the soul cannot exist without its other side, which is always found in a you. So Western psychology has been very interior focused. Like somehow it's an interior job to shape a self. But it's a relational process. My soul is shaped by conviviality. The alchemist Sendivogius said the greater part of the soul lies outside the body. So it's in the overlap. It's in our overlap. Even through Zoom, we overlap through our words, through our feeling, through our intention, through our desire to make contact about something so crucial, about being human. So we have to have tremendous compassion for where we are and grieve into that hole, grieve into the emptiness, weep, weep, weep into that emptiness. I often say the opposite of emptiness is not fullness, it's presence, it's embodiment, it's entanglement. That's the opposite of emptiness. So when we remember those filaments, when we remember, the chi lines that are, always coming in and out of our bodies. So, yeah.
Thank you. Oh, I love that. The opposite of emptiness is not fullness. Yes, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So we've spent a good amount of time today talking about this kind of that hole, the cold, this grief, and how we got there and how we have that. So as we get towards wrapping up, let's move into back into that warmth a little bit for a moment. Now, you mentioned earlier today in our talk, and I've also heard you, really grabbed my interest, heard you on some other interviews talking about referencing I believe an alchemical point that says something along the lines of we achieve transformation with the addition of heat and warmth, and by warmth we can cook and transform. And I was really excited to hear that, because that plays in with Tibetan medicine elemental theory very well. It absolutely corresponds, because we have this fire element, which is a universal principle of heat and warmth. And then when we talk about our own human health, our own physiology, how does fire and heat express physiologically within our human dimension? We call that tipa. And we have that inner fire that is entirely or very much related with transformation. And so that whether it be digestion under the influence of our inner fire, or whether it be growth and development through the stages from childhood to adulthood, and there's the influence of that tipa, that fire element, and then whether it be our emotional power of motivation and inspiration and courage, confidence, all of that comes from that heat, that transformation power of fire. So I was really interested to hear a little bit more about your knowledge and perspective on that alchemical point. How do we cook our sorrow? How do we transform that cold, stagnated toxin of grief and use heat to transform that? Can you share a little bit more about that with us?
Sure, I'd love to. I guess the beginning point would be to see, how is it that we each hold our relationship to grief? Is it stiff-armed? Are we mistrusting of it, fearful of it? Do we try to keep it at a distance? Do we try to run away from it? All of those things generate cold. They keep that energy of grief frozen, and it congeals and hardens in the heart. I mean, we often die of congestive heart failure in our culture, right? That's the number one cause of death. I'm sure Tibetan medicine has a lot to say about what is congesting our hearts. It isn't just our diets. It's also a lot of this emotional frozenness that doesn't get to move. So we have to bring warmth to it. We have to begin to thaw our relationship to, well, many emotions. That second gate of grief I mentioned, which is the parts of us that have never known love. My exuberance may maybe not have been welcomed in my family. My sensuality, my sadness, my anger, all those things got pushed out and became what I call outcast parts of me. They live in cold territories. They live in the wastelands, and it's cold. And so there's no movement. So part of the movement towards reconciling with my outcast brothers is to bring my own vulnerability, my own tears, my own grief, my own amends. I have to apologize to these parts of me and say, I'm so sorry I blamed you for my loneliness in the world, for my feeling like I don't belong here. I blamed you. You were actually the source of my return to the world. So I have to coax them slowly over time. Patience is one of the primary ingredients of warming something. You heat something too fast, it turns to ash. Alchemy says alchemists were called masters, artists in fire. That's what they were called. So learning how to titrate, how to manage how much heat is required. And you notice over time, more heat's required for certain things and less for others. When people come into my office to do therapy, I start off with the bain marie, the double boiler. It's slow. It's like a warm bath. I provide compassion. I provide a place of safety and welcome. A place that says, I see you and I hear you and your pain matters. That allows the beginning process of warming the material to happen. But if we only stay there, not much change occurs. So over time, we have to increase the heat a little bit. We have to begin to challenge basic stances in the world, basic structures of belief or ideology, and or behaviors that can consistently devalue their lives or whatever. We have to begin to increase the heat. So with grief, we start by looking at our judgments about it, and then we begin to bring it close in. I often say that in the apprenticeship, we have to come into right relationship with our sorrow, like a companion, like someone who's walking beside me forever. They will always be there. Once we understand those 5 gates of grief, we know that grief is always there. And can I have it as a companionship? Kind of have a bittersweet melancholy to my character, that makes my heart tender for the sorrows of other people, that I can feel you. I can feel your grief. Without that relationship, if I'm stiff-arming grief and keeping it cold, my capacity to have compassion for others is very limited. So we warm it by coming into friendship with it, befriending it. We warm it then through our own attention. James Hillman, one of my primary teachers and mentors, said that you get from the fire only what the fire is fed. You get from the fire only what the fire is fed. So if you don't feed the fire, no change, no transformation, no movement. So we feed the fire again through our affection. We bring our heart to our grief. Through our effort, you write, you draw, you dance, you take it into ritual space, you share it with trusted friends. All those are efforts that bring warmth to that space. If it stays in a place of shame and isolation, again, it will stay cold. So we warm it through this process of approximation, coming closer to it, listening to it, finding the courage to stay present with it, to develop the outrageous courage of the Bodhi heart, as Pema Chodron would say, to sit with the hardest things that we have to sit with. Part of the reason why we're so afraid of grief, and one of the reasons why it stays cold, is that we are condemned to face it privately. And grief has always been communal. In our long story as a species, grief has never been private. And suddenly in the last, I don't know, couple hundred years, it's become very private. You even go to the private practice to talk about your grief. You go see a therapist, which is fine. Please keep coming. But at the same time, I tell most everybody I work with on that theme, this is a good place to begin to tolerate contact around your grief and your pain. But ultimately, you'll need a larger holding body to really do the deep work of releasing it. So again, that's the titration of heat. We start one-on-one, tolerating contact with that grief, begin to develop faith in grief again. But it's not there to take them hostage. It's not there to wipe them out. People often say, if I go into that place of grief, I'm never coming back. Because there's so much. And I say, well, if you don't go there, you're never coming back. Because so much of you has been locked away in that grief. And they have to come back for your own being to be whole again. So then we titrate the grief up to larger holding vessels, and to the point where you get to a full-fledged grief ritual. There, the heat is intense. And we cook for 3 days, and to the point of it's ready to really erupt and be expressed fully. But again, this is the wisdom of traditional cultures. They don't do this once a year. And then, in American sense, well, I went to a grief ritual, I should be done with my grief. Well, when I went to Burkina Faso in West Africa, and spending several weeks living there, and there was a grief ritual someplace in the village almost every day. And they were one of the most free, emotional people I've ever met. I remember coming up to one woman saying, "You have so much joy." And she said, "That's because I cry a lot." There's the relationship between that lower register of grief and the upper register of joy. When you eliminate that lower register of grief, you collapse the upper register of joy. And we live in what I call a flatline culture, a very narrow band of what we're allowed to live. So grief work is also about reclaiming joy, and that you see that almost at every grief ritual, that by the end of the ritual, there's an infectious joy rippling through the room. People are giddy because there's been some relief and some release of this weightiness, this heaviness that has been kind of, dampening our delight in life. So hopefully that responded to some of your question about how do we bring warmth to and fire? How do we work with fire around grief? Yeah.
Yes, I believe so. Thank you. Yes. Wow. Well, thank you so much, Francis. I really have appreciated all of this. It's amazing work. I have to say, personally, I'm in the deepest admiration for this work that you're doing with people. It is so important. And I know in my private practice, talk to people for 15 minutes, and that can be a lot. So a 3-day intensive grief ritual, I just truly admire your dedication and your capacity. I think it's amazing. So thank you for sharing with us a little bit about all of that and sharing your wisdom with us.
And again, thank you for meeting me in that correspondence, the reflection back from your traditions and what you're learning. And I love getting outside of our white Western, mindset and looking at this, what we're facing from multiple perspectives, and including traditional cultures. And that's where I think we're going to have to reconnect up to our own indigenous roots and remember that at one point, that's how we all lived. We all lived with a wisdom tradition connected to land, to place, to ritual, to the sacred, to the ancestors, to the plants, to the animals. That's how we all lived. And that's deep in our bones. Carl Jung says we have an unforgotten wisdom at the core of our psyche. And that unforgotten wisdom is the carrier of that knowing. And we can remember what it looks like to be human. We can remember what it looks like, who I am, where I belong, and what is sacred. We can remember those three iterations of being. So thank you, Adam. I enjoyed this very much.
So how can people connect with your work and learn more about what you're doing, and how can they connect with you a little more, our audience?
The easiest way is just to go to francisweller.net, and obviously the offerings right now are pretty lean. They're mostly online, but hopefully sometime next year we'll be able to gather again and do our ritual work in community, side by side. All my writings are on there, audio programs that people can listen to, and all chewing on the same material. How do we live as human beings? You know, living a soulful life. There's a series on there, The Alchemy of Initiation. You know, how do we take, in the absence of any true initiatory process, how does psyche keep pushing us to the edge of ripening? You know, because you know, as I say in the series, you know, initiation is not optional. You will be taken to the edge, and hopefully you will accept the challenge of ripening into a mature human being and bring back your gifts to the people. So that's the best way.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much again for your time. Thank you for accepting our invitation. It's wonderful to connect with you. And we certainly wish you many blessings, and hopefully we can connect with you again. And I know for a fact that our director, Menpa Phuntsog Wangmo, would love to meet you and chat with you. So hopefully we can have some opportunity again in the future.
I'd be honored.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for tuning in. This has been the Chongxiang School of Tibetan Medicine webinar series. With our special guest, a fantastic, inspiring conversation with Mr. Francis Weller. Please do check out his website and his content, his books, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, the essays, In the Absence of the Ordinary. And I think there's a lot of great content on his website and YouTube and whatnot as well. So many blessings on everybody. Please subscribe and follow us, the Chongxiang Institute, School of Tibetan Medicine. We wish you well, and we will see you next time. I'm Adam Okerblom, and thank you so much. Bye-bye for now.